You're good.
All right. So hi, my name is Zora Gilbert. I am a linguistics major with minors in psychology and professional writing. And today I am going to present on how students vary their dialects in on-task activities in the classroom. So that was kind of jargony. I'm looking at specifically how students use stigmatized features in the classroom. And a stigmatized feature is a feature that, for the most part, English teachers look at and go, so they're features that are kind of looked down upon by the standard language ideology, and I'll get to what language ideology is in a moment, of the US, and especially of the academic sphere. And then when I say on-task activities, I'm talking about times in the classroom when the students are really discussing what the teacher has assigned them. So what is academically relevant, what the general classroom focus is supposed to be, rather than when they're just like having a conversation or gossiping in the corner or whatever. So how students use stigmatized features of English when they are working on academic work. And then in my case, I'm mostly looking at features of African American English because my students are mostly African American students. So this study, which is part of my senior honors thesis, is kind of synthesizing three fields of research in sociolinguistics. The first is the field of dialect variation and identity. So how people use language is sometimes used to signal what groups they feel they identify with. So, for example, an African American person who uses features of African American English in their speech might be signaling that they identify with that community, or wanting to draw out that aspect of their identity in a specific moment. Most research, if this research is done in schools, it's mostly done in off-task scenarios. So it might be done in the hallways between class periods, it might be done in the lunchroom, it might be done when the students are just like chatting about whatever in a classroom, but not when they're working on their schoolwork. And then another field of study is English language learners and their classroom roles. So the study I'm thinking of specifically is one by Constance Elwood, done in 2008. And she looked at English language learners in Canada as they were learning English in an English class, and how they would use their different languages, their native languages, in the classroom environment to signal whether or not they agreed with, or were comfortable with, or were happy with the class activity, or if they weren't feeling it so much. So whether they accepted the language ideology of the classroom, the language of the classroom, and the activities of the classroom, or whether they were rejecting them and choosing to use their own language rather than English. And then, of course, there's the study of classroom language ideology. So how people feel about language in the classroom, how they feel about what language is used in the classroom, and how they feel about what language should be used in the classroom. And this has a lot of political impact and is very, very relevant to our thinking about what's quote-unquote proper or correct. The thing we generally think of as proper or correct is called standard or standardized American English. Might also be referred to as academic English, school English, or formal English. Lots of names. And that's the language that I'm speaking right now. I'm speaking formally. I'm using exclusively features that English teachers, well, hopefully I'm using exclusive features that English teachers not approvingly at, though I dangle some prepositions here and there. And then I'm looking at how students use features of African American English, all of which are stigmatized in the classroom environment. And it's important to note that I'm looking at features of African American English rather than the use of African American English as like a dialect, because I'm conceptualizing linguistic inventories, so what speech sounds people can use, as repertoires of individual features that they can pick and choose to accomplish certain goals that they might have. And this choice might be conscious or it might not be, but it's still a choice. They can vary their speech. So using a specific feature, it probably has a reason or a purpose. And at the very least, it has an effect. And then one more thing, I'm looking at specifically features of grammar and vocabulary. So grammar is how people structure their sentences, and vocabulary is what words they use. My research site, I'm looking at high school students in Pittsburgh. I have audio and sometimes video recordings, and for all of these, there was a white researcher present. And so that might affect how students were comfortable speaking. And also, These are in places where standardized American English is the dominant language and the expected language. Teachers generally agree that students, quote unquote, need to learn standardized American English in order to get ahead. And students pretty much all agree that standard American English is expected in schools, even if they don't expect that it, or agree with the fact that it should be expected in schools. So there's that pressure that's always present as well. All right, this is, again, part of my senior honors thesis. And I've already done some research as part of as a pilot study for Dr. Barbara Johnstone's Language and Globalization class last semester. So these are my observations for that. In this pilot study, I had 45 minutes of classroom video data, and the class was mostly African American and white students, and they were learning about punctuation. So they were speaking about language, which may or may not be relevant. Hard to know. But it's good to note that they were thinking about how people use language, so that might have affected their awareness of their own speech. The first half hour of this data is a call and response style lecture, and then the last 15 minutes are group work. So most of the lecture, the teacher is heavily involved, and the students are kind of responding to her rather than driving the discussion themselves. And then I transcribed and analyzed interactions where the students used more than one word, so that they had a little more space to have opinions. What I observed was that students used features of African American English far more when they were addressing the teacher for the first time, so starting an interaction with her, than when the teacher called on them and directly engaged them in an interaction. So for example, in this box on this side, the left, the teacher asserts that you see periods and abbreviations, and Dina interrupts. She engages the teacher in an interaction, whereas before the teacher was just talking to the whole class. And then another scenario, a student named Marcus interrupts the teacher to ask if he had to read something again. However, students almost never use features of African American English if the teacher engages them. So they might use features of African American English when they're starting a conversation with the teacher, but once the teacher starts talking to them directly back, they stop using those features. And if the teacher addresses them in the first place, they don't use features of African American English. So why might this be? Students have an idea of the expected language ideology for the classroom. And the teacher is part of the academic environment and a kind of a symbol of power or authority in the classroom. So her presence and her direct interaction might serve as a reinforcement of that ideology. And then, of course, students, they still know about the ideology, and they might be reacting to it. If they disagree with something that's being asserted or established by this academic environment, they might use language that the academic environment doesn't support as a way to reject the idea that was just pronounced, espoused. And we can see this in the Dina example where she's disagreeing with the teacher. She disagrees that periods are always used in abbreviations because she doesn't do that. And so she's kind of amplifying her disagreement by her choice of speech. Okay. This is continuing research, and I now have 2 different classes. These classrooms are entirely African American students. Classroom 1 has an African American teacher, and classroom 2 has a white teacher. These classrooms are both doing the same unit on dialect variation, so they're actually learning about dialect variation in the class, which once again may affect how aware they are of their actual speech. And classroom 1 is 20 minutes of structured class discussion, so the students are talking to each other, but the teacher is facilitating. So she's very present, but not necessarily engaged in the discussion. And then classroom 2 is 30 minutes of small group discussion where it's just the students. There's 3 students talking to each other. And later there's 12 minutes of whole class discussion where the teacher is leading and genuinely engaging in the interaction. And then I roughly transcribed this with a focus on the students' utterances rather than the teacher's utterances. And I'm beginning to count all the utterances and do a quantitative analysis. So at a first pass, I'm noticing that there aren't any turn order effects like there were with the pilot study data. So it doesn't seem to matter if the teacher has engaged in the interaction or not. students will use features of African American English regardless of whether or not they're in a direct conversation with the teacher. However, the teacher's presence at all in a discussion still really matters. In classroom 2, during the 30 minutes of small group discussion, there were 38 utterances that contained features of African American English in 30 minutes. But later on in that same hour, when the teacher entered the discussion, there were only 8 utterances that had features of African American English in 12 minutes. And so you can just see that the frequency is much, much less frequent. Because the teacher is, or possibly because the teacher is engaging in the interaction. And so this is actually consistent, because this teacher is still this authority figure in the classroom. She's still this symbol of the academic ideology. And so she's still enforcing the language ideology of the classroom. It may be that the differences that I'm observing have to do with the fact that the population of the classroom is simply different. It also might have been a different day, or classroom 1 might have been like a very specific scenario. But either way, we're noticing that when the teacher becomes more involved, students use features of African American English less. Another thing I noticed is that the researcher's presence didn't seem to matter at all. The researcher actually interacted with the small group of 3 students for the whole 30 minutes, but they still talked freely and used lots of features of African American English. So my guess is that even though the researcher was white and not a speaker of African American English, she wasn't a symbol of the academic ideology in a way that the teacher was. So where am I going with this? My next steps are to kind of amp up the quantitative aspects of my research. I need to refine my transcriptions and continue quantifying the data so I can get really clear numbers on frequency, on how much certain speakers use African American English, and just get more numbers that I can work with and look at different directions. But I'm also going to keep my qualitative research going. I'm also going to try and examine individual interactions a little bit more and think about those turn order effects, like I did with the pilot study. See if it matters who started the interaction and who's responding and what the topics of the discussions are. And then I'm also going to look at those classroom roles a little bit more closely and think about when the students in this new data are using African American English and how they feel about what's being asserted in the classroom at the time. Right, I'm just about done, but before I wrap up, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Amanda Godley at the University of Pittsburgh, because she's graciously allowing me to use her data. It's part of her continuing research into language ideology in American high schools, and it's really, really interesting. If any of you are interested in checking her out. I also want to give a shout out to my advisor, Barbara Johnstone, who is in the audience. All right, that is it. Thank you, and I will be presenting the rest of my research at Meeting of Minds. Yes.
So I have 2 questions. One is, so in your quantitative analysis, what exactly are you looking for? So you talked about teacher involvement and researcher involvement. Are you looking for that kind of stuff, or basically just what are you looking for?
So right now, I'm really curious about I'm really interested in topics right now. I haven't moved forward with that avenue of research yet because it takes a lot of time and you have to kind of decide how to define your topics. But I'm really curious about how much people use features of African American English when they're talking about a certain topic and how maybe salient their speech might be to them at that moment.
Sorry, second question. So what do you see as the future implications of this study? What do you hope to do with it, basically?
So this is going to be me getting on my soapbox a little bit, which is, I think, why I kept it out of the presentation. But people talk how they talk, right? Speech is, to a certain extent, a choice. But when you're trying to learn something, it's not helpful to also be trying to learn that thing using a language that feels forced, right? So my interest in this study comes from the fact that I want to see how students really use language when they're learning and when they're interacting with each other. And when they're in small groups together and talking to each other, and they use lots of features of African American English, but are still being very productive, which they were, I don't see any reason why this language ideology of the classroom needs to kind of force out all of these features that students are comfortable using. I understand the pressures for them to learn standardized American English, but I don't really understand why it needs to be a sink or swim scenario. So I'm trying to prove, or at least gain evidence, that students use this language in a productive, like on task, you know, gratifying to the academic complex way, so that they can keep using it and be comfortable in their speech when they're trying to learn. Yes?
In any of these studies, did the teacher ever comment on their use of those features that you saw?
No, not in the data I've watched. And the only time any of these teachers made a well, okay, so they were talking about dialect variation, so they talked about it a lot.
Right.
But not the use by the student. The only time the teacher in one of the classrooms, it was actually African American teacher, made a comment about like any of them using African American English was when she was talking about herself, and how she had like, I think she said it was like old people slang or something, because she had grown up many years before these kids, and so language has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking about how dialect might vary between generations.
Right.
Yeah.
What was the age of the researcher in relation to the students or the teacher?
I actually don't know how old the teacher or the researcher was exactly, but the researcher wasn't near their age.
Okay.
She's like an established researcher. It was actually
Alright.
Amanda Godley.
Okay.
She had her PhD. She was like well above their age. She would have been clearly seen as an adult. Yeah.
I mean, I'd just be interested if you still have access to the teachers to see the teachers' language attitudes and the way that they would characterize like the classroom environment that they've already grown accustomed to.
Yeah. So I haven't actually read them, but I've talked to Dr. Godley about them a lot, and she did interview some of the teachers. And the teacher the African American teacher in this new data claimed to be one of the like strictest and strongest supporters of standard American English in the classroom, but she never once corrects anyone. And she also, so she never once corrects anyone by saying what's the proper way to say this, or even by rephrasing a student statement in standard American English. So she, even though she claims that she's like a strong supporter of standard American English in the classroom, she didn't enforce it very strongly with her students. And I don't have any like moral feelings about that. I just think it's really interesting.
You know, yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious about the notion of choice here. And I don't have any views on this, I'm just curious about it, right? So one of the things you said at the beginning is that you're interested in particular features because you take these to be a sort of collection of features that people can choose to use or not use. And I can see that there's choice in the sense that we see, right? I mean, your data shows the same individual sometimes using that feature and sometimes not using it. But normally when we talk about choice, right, we're thinking of a conscious decision to do something or not do something. And my general impression is that, well, sometimes speakers make conscious decisions to use a particular feature in a particular environment. Often they may be slipping back and forth between different variants without even knowing that they're doing it. So can you just say something about that?
Yeah, so I think if your options are like conscious choice and unconscious, like, oh gosh, there's a word for this and I don't know what it is. Unconscious, I don't know, habit or like restriction within certain habits or pull towards certain habits. I think there's a little bit of both. People are always going to have language that they're most comfortable with. And I feel like this analogy is sketchy and I'm not sure why, but I'm going to use it. Just like I'm most comfortable wearing like jeans and a t-shirt, right? And if I have any sort of like choice, I'm going to wear jeans and a t-shirt. So, and I'm also most comfortable speaking in like a much more casual language that I'm speaking in now. And I might slip into that, perhaps. But I have agency. I can choose to not wear jeans and a t-shirt, and I can also choose to speak in a more formal register or a more casual register if that suits the goals I'm aiming for. So even though there's a lot of like not quite conscious phenomena that happen with speech, there's also an element of agency that I don't think gets brought up enough in literature and in just general social discourse about speaking. I actually got shown the
Can I
end
just ask
sign.
one super quick
Okay.
question? Okay, so I just, so they were using features this much in this study and then it went down, or like in this part of the classroom and then it went down in the second part of the classroom. Is that because the speakers who used features of AAE were like not speaking anymore?
It was not. They spoke lots.
Okay, so they still,
Yeah.
it was the same people. It wasn't just because like they got quiet. It was
Yeah, no,
because-
they kept speaking. One of
Okay,
the
so
things
they-
I've noticed is that obviously when the teacher shows up, the teacher's gonna talk, right? Which is why I want to get deeper into the quantitative analysis and like look at utterances per person, per time period, and that kind of thing. All right, thank you very much.